today I'm gonna not only present my own work or my own investigations, but also look at works by other artists and architects and try to establish an understanding of, sorry, I'll risk, but
it's a new one.
It's new, that's great, yeah. Try to establish an understanding of transgression that not only is about crossing a boundary, but more about making that, rendering that boundary visible, and thus, questioning it. So, I mean, risking to state the obvious, I want to start with how I perceive urban space, and urban space as not only a physical, infrastructural or superstructural construct, but also a social, political, and economical construct, which is constantly produced and reproduced, so it's also always in the making. Urban space is composed of layers, of structural strata, of life, maybe most importantly, of institutional constructs, which then frame that life, and of networks. These layers overlap and collide, and they make the city actually full of borders, boundaries, and limits. The city, in its constant making, involves an endless set of reconfigurations as well. And these reconfigurations can be in terms of use, of the meaning attributed to spaces, but also much more physically and sometimes even violent reconfigurations, where we see, for example, cases of demolitions, forced evictions, which are part of the reality of cities on a global level. Today's cities appear to be characterized by this climate of crisis, and the urban community is of a divided nature. Its geography is uneven in every sense. Whether through emergent investment patterns or sheer conflict, the limits within today's cities seem to be ever solidifying. So I think I think there seems to be a need for relocating transgression in the contemporary global city, in this city of limits and boundaries, which, as I said, is increasingly becoming more divided, both physically and also in terms of invisible limits in the cities. Yet I would like to stay away from overconsumed, subversive notion of transgression. These subversive acts, which in themselves are, in my opinion, ready to be internalized by market as already like sales or advertisement tools, and move towards a concept of transgression whose power lies in its processes of making the limits visible, both of itself and the systems and the structures it inhabits and transgresses. And I built most of my understanding of transgression on especially Foucault's reading of Bataille, which also came up several times during these 2 days. But Foucault's interpretation of the work of Georges Bataille has been for me really influential in approaching transgression. And he discusses transgression as an action involving the limit, as an action that has its entire space actually in the line it crosses, including the flash of its passage, its entire trajectory, even its origin. So, we start with 2 situations that I have investigated in probably through the more than 10 years now, I guess. But, yeah, they always come in handy. So the first one is the minibar, and we are now in Ankara, in the image. And the minibar, as it's anonymously named, consists of young people's temporary utilization of public space, of existing urban elements around and between the buildings, for the sake of simply socializing and hanging out, spending the night, basically nightlife. The minibar phenomenon reveals a potential, in my opinion, because any simple element of architecture, such as these kind of boundary walls, hold an inherent excess, an excess that can be revealed by certain actions or certain moments. And this excess can shift the meaning in the urban realm. The triggers of the minibar are not primarily architectural in the design sense, maybe, but they are elements of the built environment. They are the sidewalks, they are the low masonry garden walls, and the spaces in between the buildings. And while they make the minibar possible through providing the kind of surfaces that people can perch on, but they also themselves become actual, you said agents today in the morning, like physical objects becoming agents, but I say actors of the making, of the production of the space in the urban realm. So the physical boundaries almost open up to become inhabited, activated, and dwelled in. The economic suspension of the service sector on the one hand, because in the minibar there is no one serving, it's just you bring your own drink or make your own cheap cocktail. So on the one hand, the suspension of the service sector and the politics of the everyday transform a casual hanging out into an act of political significance. Negotiations are made, conflicts prevail. For example, here you see like the bottom stone wall used to be one of the most popular spots, and one day you would have this brick wall built on top of it simply to prevent people from sitting there. So the act of building almost becomes an agent to prevent space. And these conflicts prevail, meaning shifts, but those streets transform. Those streets are actually never the same again. So the minibar presents us a moment where the limits of the planned or the designed space are revealed and maybe exhausted. Usually I'm also struggling with myself that how to address the kind of political potential to such an hedonistic act. But since we are in a kind of conference on transgression and Altay being himself, I think he would have asked, like, why exclude such hedonistic acts from the political discourse at all? Self-exhaustion, self-consumption, drinking, these were the topics that he was dealing with a lot. And one more thing I should add is that with the current political climate, in Turkey, the Turkish government now actually intervening to lifestyles, the minibars become ever more political because it becomes like a confrontational ground to exercise the youth's right to consume themselves, to exhaust themselves through drinking. Yeah. So, well, to define their boundaries, societies usually tend to cast aside those who remain outside the norms they set, forgetting that any society is actually a collective of those who have nothing in common. The urban poor, the sans-papiers, the homeless, the Roma are such definitive groups whose rights are still refused in today's cities all around, both in Europe and elsewhere. The paperman, which is the second situation or investigation I want to talk about, as they call themselves, they go through the streets of cities such as Istanbul in search of recyclable items and material from the garbage. They collect and organize otherwise undivided masses of garbage into mobile piles ready for recycling. They act before the So they are very mobile, and they act before the official garbage collection takes place. So there is an official garbage collection system, but the papermen somehow intervene to that in-between zone, both temporarily and spatially. So they act before the official garbage collection takes place, so that they can, exactly as I said, inhabit such a both spatial and temporal kind of liminal zone within the city. And even though they are clandestine, unrecognized, and definitely unofficial, their profession, in their self-expression, the only choice of survival besides crime, so it's kind of, you can imagine the kind of social strata, becomes also supportive of the very system that pushed them aside, that kind of neglected them, because in terms of simply ecology, economy, the rate of recycling actually in major cities, not only in Turkey, but South America, and probably elsewhere in the world, is actually, the recycling rates are actually quite high due to practices such as the paperman. So in a way, they do not cross a boundary, but they operate within a boundary, or they perform a boundary, you can say. They make use of the refuse, and they reveal the limits of the municipal collection system, a city institution, one can say, while making a living out of this kind of zone. So what the minibar and paperman both do, and we can see some images. What they do is actually, as I said, a kind of negotiating a boundary. So also with the minibar, it's nothing like Magaluf. It's always kind of occupying an in-between space. It's never taking over the streets, but it's negotiating that boundary rather than crossing it maybe. But this negotiation nevertheless reveals the existence of such limits spatially and urban-wise, and also hence challenge our preconceptions about those boundaries and the way system operates, the way this city structure operates. So like garbage that the papermen reutilize through their profession, there are many invisible yet directly architectural excess that is inherent today in our cities. A work I want to talk about is The Parasite from '97 by Michael Rakowitz. And he mainly works with the homeless. So it's surprising how helpless actually the systems and structure becomes, and how offensive they get when they encounter a group who do not fit their definition, of the norm. And the possibility of being without a home is almost incomprehensible to many, especially those who run or who kind of operate the so-called systems. And we know, probably we all have observed the late 20th century seeing so much investment and invention going into making architecture homeless-proof. Yet there is all this excess provided by the city and its architecture already, such as heating, ventilation, air condition, outlets that pump out heat and air, actually heated air, out of a building continuously. So what Michael does is almost kind of materializing and capturing that outlet and using it to make these shelters for the homeless, and through individually engaging. So here are some of his sketches, and you can trace, like this is a shelter he did for a couple, and this is kind of very individual, very personal process of dialogue. Of course it's limited. I mean, he has done by far for 13 individuals or couples in this case, but nevertheless it makes the action itself makes visible the perceived limits and the use of the city, the street, as much as the byproducts of the buildings that lay on it. And parasites also show us that there is a kind of different sense of individuality, and individuality that is other than the consumerist individual, but almost like a, I don't know, the scapegoat of the city. Okay, so here are some other examples. Yeah. So exclusions from the city. So now I'm going back to where I started, more like the global urban condition. And try to talk about a bit how today many cities are being formed and transformed through processes of forced evictions, demolitions, reconstructions, mostly in the name of urban regeneration, but kind of quite heavy-handedly in many places. And masses of social groups, whole neighborhoods get relocated to make way for new development. One project I want to talk about is the Cyber Mohalla Hub by Nikolaus Hirsch and Michel Müller. So when a heavy-handed regeneration plan hits a 30-year-old incrementally built neighborhood in Delhi, the inhabitants were directed to a resettlement colony. The Cyber Mohalla, Mohalla here means neighborhood, is a project of labs and studios for experimentation, mainly through literature, that used to operate in that neighborhood, which was forcefully relocated, and involving young people from different working class areas around that part of town. And so they were operating from there, and they were inhabitants there. And when the relocation occurred, when the area was bulldozed, they invited architects Nikolaus Hirsch and Michel Miller to design a hub in a plot in this supposedly new colony that they are supposed to relocate. And the design also involves a physical challenge. It's only like a 3 meter by 6 meter plot. So I think 10 foot by 20 foot. So tiny plot, very rigidly organized plots, and everybody gets a plot and builds their house there. But the designed response to this challenge did not wait for the actual plot to be secured, or even the relevant funds to be raised for its construction on the actual site in Delhi. Instead, it fragmented itself into its parts in order to be made and remade as settings, with each prototype or partial construction being shown in different museums and art centers to ultimately reach its destined plot. And this is maybe also worth discussing. During the last 2 days, we touched upon the kind of art world as a structure and what it enables and what it disables. But so the Cyber Mohalla Hub initiated from the limits of a confined space of massive urban reorganization, and reflecting on those same limiting urban processes, manifests itself internationally and in a way super spatially, as parts and portions of it start kind of being installed, raised, and constructed in a way all around the world. This is from the Manifesta European Biennial of Art in Italy, and it occurred in many different places. And kind of traveling with the support of another existing international structure, which is called the art world. And it has done so while enjoying the self-reflexivity that is allowed and even nurtured by the spaces of art. And at the same time, but at the same time, discussing the tangled and fractured wider urban scheme that's affecting cities globally. So whether all parts constructed offered really a potentiality to be used, whether or how these parts would travel back to Delhi is one very valid set of questions. But there is also another set of questions that revolve around how the Cyber Mohalla Hub inhabits this so-called art institutional context and throughout its journey, and whether or not how this journey contributes to the actualization of the project. This is, I think, also another set of quite valid questions. And such kind of metacriticality towards the process and the context, in my opinion, does not detract from the actual crisis on the site. On the contrary, it allows a production of meaning that contributes to criticality, especially towards such a toxic cocktail of neoliberal policies and urban cleansing discourses. So I go back to the question of margins. This is also really important for me. The periphery of the contemporary city is not only geographically but also socially peripheric. It includes the outskirts of the city as well as very, very, very central neighborhoods inhabited by the socially peripheral. An example that I personally experienced could be the Sulukule area in Istanbul, where the Roma community was used to reside, and now it's completely bulldozed several years ago. Or the Tarlabaşı neighborhood, which again I tried to be involved in some ways. Actually a super central place, right near to Taksim Square, and actually where the papermen that I showed usually operate, because in that area they had this kind of underneath the building small workshops. They could process the garbage, so they have like very huge proximity to the center, to the city center, the commercial center, yet they exercise everything in a very kind of inner city context. But this part of town is also now completely demolished. And again, in both cases, the usual pretext being one of urban cleansing, urban development, and things like that. So another maybe, how can we say, another example that we can discuss, continuing with this relationship to the art institution or the art world, and without being kind of naive about how the artworks operates, but also noticing that how so many inclusions and exclusions, that system also has the insides and outsides. So in my opinion, this work by Thomas Hirschhorn, Musée Précaire Albinais, it kind of plays with the perceived limits of the notions around where art should be viewed and by whom. And the limits, as well as the limits to the current urban condition and its now inherent injustices. In collaboration with the youths from the housing blocks of the Parisian Cité Albinais and the Landy area, Hirschhorn here created a makeshift museum in the neighborhood and convinced Paris's Centre Pompidou, which is the kind of state's contemporary art museum, probably you all are familiar with the Centre Pompidou, to loan works by 8 true masters to be hosted in this precarious museum. And not only kind of secondary value works or replicas or things like that, but actual kind of really the highest representative of these artists' works. And these artists include, like, as I said, real masters. So they are like Fernand Léger, Marcel Duchamp, Le Corbusier, Salvador Dali, Piet Mondrian, Andy Warhol, Kazimir Malevich, and Joseph Beuys. Almost untouchable in their place in art history, in 20th century art history. So these works by these artists are showcased as kind of weekly solo shows in this precarious museum, accompanying workshops and talks by historians, as well as many other events held by the kind of local community takes place. And as Hirschhorn himself claims, quote, with the loan of original works from the Centre Pompidou, which for a long time nobody really believed would happen, we reached the limits of the institution, unquote. This museum as artwork does not only bridge a gap or provide a space for art to be viewed in such a neighborhood, but it performs a twofold transgression. The limits it crosses and makes visible are of the art institution as well as the urban condition, questioning both the publicness of the art institution, the so-called public space of the museum, the state Centre Pompidou, as well as the latent spatial injustice in the city. The transgression reveals the political economical impasses of these constructs, breaking them apart through the sovereignty granted to the artist and the social implications and inclusions that the artwork embodies, albeit momentarily. And this is not the Musée Précaire Albinais, but this is the Bataille monument that Hirschhorn did elsewhere in Kassel. But I put this slide to give you an idea also of the shabbiness of the structures, because the images I have from the Musée are more like interiors and kind of details. So this would give you an idea of the physicality. So, yeah, so some boundaries maintain themselves as long as they remain invisible or unquestioned. Transgression is remarkable because it forces the limit to face the limit of its being. If we are to talk of any responsibility of transgression, I think it lies in making these boundaries visible, forcing boundaries to face their limits, rather than simply crossing them. Yet the question remains, can such an inhabitation of both physical and institutional spaces simply render boundaries meaningless, the boundaries that actually kind of make them exist. And even when transgression is at stake, doesn't it lead to a creation of new boundaries? I mean, for sure, lots of paradox are involved when we talk about transgression. And perhaps for the good of it, this is why transgression can neither become a prescription drug for architecture, nor another buzzword that will keep its actors occupied. The value of transgression, however, still lies in how it activates these inherent accesses that I was talking about, the excess, that is always inherently evident in any kind of context, any structure, and how transgression makes us face our preconceptions, our expectations from the systems and structures we inhabit. And this I used very broadly, like it can be the city, it can be a disciplinary context, it can be any kind of system and structure we think we inhabit. And we inhabit many of these systems and structures simultaneously. So, yeah, we are also inhabitants. And so, in architecture, much like public art, there is almost always power behind the work, ranging from the state to social benefactors, from seekers of prestige to developers with regeneration plans. And this I call the presence of power. And the presence of power is almost always somehow there. This could be directly funding, this could be a commission, this could be a kind of creating the context. Yet there is also the power of presence, which is again, I would like to believe or propose, is evident somehow when you do something. Referring to how the work or a project or an action actually works, what it calls for, what it triggers, transgresses, how it touches those who encounter it. And that encounter, I think, is also a really important thing to consider. And what such work means to the people who co-inhabit public space with it, or what such a project means to the people who encounter it. This presence is both similar and complementary to the presence of people that I was talking about a bit in the minibar, like through inhabiting transgression, through a kind of presence of being there simply, of inhabitation as an essential aspect in and of the city. So, I mean, yeah, and there is, I think, a kind of, not a balance, but it's almost as if we can look at many projects and many actions and many works through how they negotiate or how they locate this presence of power and the power of presence. Especially in traditional public art, you would have the monument, right? That's almost total presence of power. Or you have the drones, that's also presence of power. Like you have these things that you know are out there that are surveying you, or you know all these kind of things, or the structures, that also the invisible structures that we know of. And so I want to move on to a final work, which is one of the most recent things I did. And here especially I faced this question of negotiating the presence of power and kind of asking to find out about the power of presence. Now, I'm not sure how it kind of ended up, but the Frieze Foundation approached me to commission a public project in the context of the London Olympics in 2012, last year. And obviously I hesitated. I was like, yeah, but no, but yeah, but no. But from the get-go, I was like, I was sure that I didn't want to make space. And they were probably inviting me due to other projects I did, such as the Church Street Partners Gazette, which was very much engaged with the neighborhood, and a project that involved the production of a local newspaper that discussed the urban situation there, or other settings or things that I did. but to reach out to the area or create a singular space in search of publicness within a pretext such as the Olympics, it just didn't make sense to me. And also at that moment, I was starting to get really interested in objects, architectural fixtures, how certain objects or architectural fixtures situate in given environments, acting almost like punctuation marks in a text. So kind of altering your reading of the space, you know, in a punctuation mark in a text kind of leads you or directs you to read in a certain way. So I wanted to offer a work that gets distributed, is almost invisible in its kind of presence, gets distributed in a neighborhood, form a network of things, and that could allow a recognition maybe from on behalf of the inhabitants or the passerby. Yeah, and thus the idea emerged to situate several identical architectural fixtures into existing public or communal spaces. And here I think I should note that this understanding of publicness, what a public building is, what a public space is, or what a communal space is also really varying still. So these slightly off-scaled doorknobs would reflect whichever room they are placed in, and offer themselves to be touched by many people who pass through these sites and buildings, and hopefully touching some of these inhabitants of the area. So this is at the YMCA, the Forest YMCA, and I should note that the pretext was that the work needed to be in one of the 5 boroughs that host the Olympics. And when I was going through London, I noticed that the Waltham Forest borough was also home to William Morris, the artist, designer, socialist, publisher, the person behind the arts and crafts movement, so to say. So it immediately kind of, in my mind at least, resonated to do a kind of functional object in the space, yet still distributed. So this is the YMCA, which is, again, a site that I probably would never have thought of as a public space, maybe, or a communal space. And the kind of slightly religious backdrop is something that I would have stated. But really, I tried to kind of reach out to different notions of communal spaces. This is a local pub, which has a theater downstairs. So here you see the entrance to the theater, again, here. This is the local vocational college. And there were also different sites, the town hall, the William Morris Museum, obviously, 2 local libraries, all these, the shopping mall as well. This is the shopping mall. So also kind of, in a way, trying to tackle the hierarchy of these different understandings of public or communal spaces. And maybe in spirit of William Morris, I also published a pamphlet which was distributed in the area. It's a guide to some doorknobs in Waltham Forest. And there is also a text where I try to discuss this notion of presence of power versus power of presence, here in red. And then also a map which located, where I work with a local inhabitant on the drawing, and it kind of locates where each doorknob is. So, I mean, you don't have to go after a kind of treasure hunt, but it's more about coming across these objects, and maybe because they are quite large, it really also experientially alters the way you cross the threshold. So you really kind of feel it. You really sense that you are passing through a door. That was also really important for me. And also the fact that they were in existing sites. Also with the Olympics, with such huge scale projects, there is always, and it already happened, there is also this kind of overarching threat of regeneration, redevelopment, maybe even demolition. So also I tried to kind of instead steer away and try to look at or reflect existing spaces. I won't undermine, I won't neglect that it's also a bit has that kind of surveillance effect, which was also something I wanted, and which was actually one of the reasons after we installed one of the sites, the community center, this one here. After a couple of days, they asked me to remove it because it reminded too much of a kind of surveillance device, you know, the convex mirror. Yeah, so to close, in a time when boundaries in the contemporary city are becoming the norm, the possibility of public space as a challenge to such norms reside in the moments and activities that make those boundaries visible, inhabit them, and thus transgress. Transgression as such allows us to collectively reconfigure the spaces and structures we are subjected to in the city. This leads to a power of presence which grows only through inhabiting and only through being there. Through activities or triggers within urban situations in ways that go beyond the preconceptions of policymakers, developers, and other actors of power who appear to be shaping our cities today. Thank you. And I was on time.
Thanks very much, Jan. A fantastic talk. And I guess just within those projects, either within institutions or outside, definitely outside the institutions, say within the playground, there seems to be a real sort of rewriting of people's relationship with their pets, which I think is quite interesting. But would anyone like to ask any very quick questions, I guess? We've got 2 or 3 minutes left.
Do you recognise humour in that work of the doorknobs?
What?
The humour in the work of the doorknobs, do you acknowledge that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, I think humor is also, I've come to think that humor is also imperative. And this kind of works, not only the doorknobs, but also the other ones that I showed, it's also, they are, of course, temporary, but they are also, in my opinion, kind of tools to expand the imagination. And I think humor really helps in expanding the imagination. And I've come to notice, especially this summer in Istanbul, we kind of went through a real kind of collective spirit, maybe for the first time in my life, with the Gezi events. And I noticed that actually imagination expands really slowly, you know, through many different things, and then it strikes suddenly. So it's kind of, these also, I think, are always, I like to consider them as kind of build-ups or kind of pushing the imagination in some way. And one day, maybe they come together in a more solid outcome. But yeah, the humor was deliberate. Yeah.
Something that I really love about the doorknobs is that it's an habituated architectural convention or trope.
On the one hand, like, it shouldn't become a trope in the sense that I keep doing it with different fixtures, but I'm really fascinated with the idea of this architectural fixture, with exactly as you put, with the thing that you would kind of presume that's already there or that's kind of working. And doing this project, I also kind of came to notice how many preconceptions there are within such fixtures. And the doorknob came out more also as a kind of, in a way, as an outsider, my interpretation of, in some sense, the kind of British idea, the relationship to buildings, and, you know, somehow it made sense. So I don't have an answer for your question, but I'm not sure, like, if I should or would kind of follow through a set of fixtures, because on the other hand, there is also the idea that this is a work that's kind of gets distributed, and the network of all these objects become the work. So it's also not a kind of singularity in that sense. So that also fascinates me. But yeah, I mean, it's a kind of burning question for me too, but I don't have an answer yet. Yeah.
How do you determine the size of the doorknob?
Yeah. Well, the diameter is 18 centimeters. I don't know how I got there. It's really through kind of, not intuitively, but through working with models and the kind of sense that's very, very tactile, in a very tactile manner. So it doesn't have any reference or any kind of direct scaling, but more on a tactile level kind of decision process.
Right, we've actually got a...
Maybe one last, because she, yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's a great question specifically for you or for sort of everybody in the room, really. A running theme I noticed throughout the day was transgression being temporal. I was wondering what everybody, if that's a question for right now, what people thought about that, whether it's because of like it responds to social aspects or the evolving nature of socialness, whether transgression is always temporal.
Well, maybe if Jan could answer that.
Yeah.
Then we could discuss that more as a group.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Or we could discuss that.
All right. I mean, I don't have a kind of prescribed notion of what is transgression, what is not transgression. I think it's more important in thinking about the moment of transgression as this kind of moment where the limits both become visible but also exhaust themselves. So in that sense, yeah, not even temporal, but like a flash, That's how also Bataille talks about it. That kind of that moment. Yeah, I mean it's a good question, but maybe to kind of digress it a little bit. This morning session, there was Doina Petrescu was talking about time as also a kind of criteria for thinking about architecture, which I think is also was a really valid and thought-provoking notion to think about time also as part of the understanding and criteria of architecture, which is in actuality the case, but the discipline of architecture rarely kind of considers that durational aspect. And maybe us as educators, we most of the time also tend to neglect that durational aspect. So I think that's maybe something to consider.
Well, actually, please keep your questions for Jan later. But
I'm happy to have them if they are directed to me.